Hello all, my name is Jason Strykowski and I want to welcome you to my presentation on a book I've just written. It is a guide to New Mexico film locations and it involves a lot of history, so I've got support from the Historical Society and I want to thank them for that. But let's continue on, theoretically. Great, so about this presentation I've got today, I'm going to have a little bit of background. We're going to go into some basics of New Mexico film history, which is quite extensive. We're going to cover some historic locations. We're going to talk about how we do film research. We're going to go on to some sources and resources. And then I'm going to tell you about some things I think about the industry. So first thing I should talk about is myself, because I am my favorite topic beyond film, of course. So this is my IMDb page, and it shows a few of the credits. I've been working in the film industry in what they call production for almost a decade, mostly as an assistant, which means I've gotten the chance to work directly for people of import. Some of the folks on the screen you might recognize, and I've worked directly for them. And mostly what I do is support capacity, but I also work as what they call a script coordinator. And in that role, I'm responsible for editing and maintaining scripts, which can be an onerous process because in certain productions, especially in television shows, you're going to send out, a script a day, essentially. So at any rate, that's a brief introduction to who I am. And on top of these responsibilities, I also am an established writer. I've been freelance writing and doing historical research in New Mexico for years as well. One funny thing about IMDb for all of those other scholars out there is that you have to very carefully vet the information you're presented. So for instance, I've never worked in the casting department, so it's funny that I have that title here. And the book, this is the cover. University of New Mexico Press did a wonderful job. I think it's really a beautiful book. I'm very proud of it. And it jumps right off the page here, and you can see a few of the locations that I talk about in the book, including White Sands. And this is the Rio Grande Gorge Bridge up by Taos. So inside the book, we're going to discuss 48 locations. I've got a filmography. I've got almost 100 photographs, many of which are historical in nature. Thank you to the Paul Andrew Hutton collection for that. I've got some insider stories. Everyone on set is very careful not to offend their employers or the studios. So perhaps you won't get all the juicy gossip you're looking for, but I think there's enough that you're going to feel satisfied if that's what you're thirsting for. Also plenty of jokes, not just from me, but from some of my coworkers. Some historical research, which I've conducted all over the state, many repositories, and also done the old-fashioned way, which is just get a hold of videos and really make sure that the locations are accurate to what is represented on the web. And then some little-known facts and stories about projects that shot in New Mexico. So I'm going to start off. The first film made in New Mexico was 1897. And we'll run through this. It's very short, so this will be fun if you haven't seen it before.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So what you're watching here is what they call Indian Day School. It was made by the Edison Company. It is a very brief actuality, and it was shot at Isleta, and these are just children on their way into and out of a schoolhouse. And what's remarkable about this is that this little short silent film was made just years after they had really created the technology. And initially, the way they set these things up is at the Edison Labs in New Jersey, they had a sort of primitive film studio called the Black Maria. And not long after that, they were able to make the technology more mobile. So the first thing they wanted to do was to go on site and shoot in places that were more exotic and that would give people in these early film houses an opportunity to kind of see the world beyond their porch. And New Mexico was one of their first destinations because we had a railroad and because we had this sense of the other. And that would continue for decades.
Of the Library of Congress. From the
Sorry about that. So we move on and right back to Isleta. And in 1912, Mary Pickford, who was one of the early silent film stars, came with D.W. Griffith um, on a film called The Pueblo Legend. And A Pueblo Legend actually mired New Mexico into controversy almost immediately because of the way that Native Americans were portrayed. The people of Isleta were not happy about the way that Griffith tried to capture them on film. And by capture them, I mean essentially make his own representation that wasn't accurate and often included white people and was certainly cultural appropriation. So the tribal council of Isleta actually detained Griffith for a number of hours because they were upset at the work that they were doing. This film actually still exists. You can find it online, and it's not necessarily a valuable document in terms of film evolution, but it's fascinating to see the way that they, very poorly researched and tried to portray New Mexico. So it's amazing, but it's also worth noting that it's potentially very offensive to some people. So we move on from there, and by 1915, a few years later, New Mexico is an active studio hub. So this is Romaine Fielding. He was an early auteur in the silent film era, and he set up a studio essentially in Silver City because his brother had written him a letter about how truly amazing Silver City was. And he arrives and he sets up, I believe it's the Lubin Film Company, and they made big multi-reel silent features. And then he moves from there to Las Vegas, New Mexico, where he and Tom Mix, one after another really, set themselves up to become some of the first major stars and directors in the area. In fact, Romaine Fielding is quite famous because he took the Plaza Hotel, which is still standing and still available and still used by film crews, and he wrote Hotel Romaine right on the side of it, which I believe is still visible if you're walking around Las Vegas. It's very cool. And Tom Mix followed up Fielding and became really one of the first kind of major Western silent film stars. And he was also quite the character and was known to tell tall tales about himself personally that are of dubious factuality. So these two guys are really a couple of the big characters in early film history. But Las Vegas, one of the things that I love about it is that their film history doesn't really stop. It continues, and to this day, it's still one of New Mexico's most in-demand film locations. On any one day, you can find film crews that are about scouting and or shooting in the area. And one of the reasons is that a lot of that historical character that was available during Fielding and Mix's day is still there. So this is a what they call a frame grab, which I took from 1984's Red Dawn, not the remake that came several decades later. And in the back, this is the Russian army. They're installing a big gun here, or transporting one rather. And behind them, you can see the Castaneda Hotel, which the Russian army, and in the film, if you haven't seen it, it's about the Russian army essentially landing in the middle of America. You can see the Castaneda Hotel, which has been recently restored. So here we've got film history coinciding with actual history of the Castaneda being an historic hotel. And it's all sort of part of the charm of Las Vegas. And the Castaneda, which you can stay at now, probably has some of that history right there at your doorstep. And then perhaps the most historic film hotel in all of New Mexico is in Gallup. There's a cool little video they did of the El Rancho.
If you ever plan to move to West, travel my way, take the highway, that's the best.
So the El Rancho, which is just outside of downtown Gallup, was built in no small part as a hotel so that early Western crews could stay there and then gain access to Monument Valley by D.W. Griffith's brother. So their ideas as entrepreneurs was to give folks in LA access to the incredible scenery in and around Gallup off the railroad with a conveniently located hotel. And if you walk into this lobby, you're going to find hundreds and hundreds of photos of all the movie stars that stayed there. And it seems almost endless. And really, it's a testament to just how important the scenery was in New Mexico to the early days of film. And we're going to skip and we're going to get right to Red Rocks, which is very close to downtown Gallup. And there's Errol Flynn, and the film is called Rocky Mountain. And it was one of many, many films that shot at Red Rocks. Red Rocks also is an important cultural area for Gallup. And then not far from Gallup, Acoma Pueblo was in films very, very early, also in the silent era. This is a film called My Name is Nobody. Sergio Leone was responsible for producing this film, and he came up with some of the story ideas for the film, but didn't actually direct it. Terrence Hill, who was the star alongside Henry Fonda, actually came back to New Mexico later and was one of the big pioneers of the Bonanza Creek Ranch usage in major filmographies. They shot right on top of Acoma in some really astounding footage.
Laying you with your engine transferred. Good.
I believe this is Acoma right here.
Yeah, you're the guy that needs an audience.
You have to be a pretty hardcore Western fan to enjoy this. It's not a Leone classic. Leone, of course, directed The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and several of those films. But it's still worth checking out. It's kind of a fun one. So we're going to go from Acoma, which was an important film location for many years, to Albuquerque. And in Albuquerque is one of my absolute favorite film locations. Again, another historical site, which has real import to the history of New Mexico, the rail yards, which were used for servicing trains, particularly steam engines. And it became very recently essentially a secondary studio for major films to come and use the cavernous space almost in any way possible. And you'll find the interior in many of your favorite films. You'll find the exterior in equally as many. And in one of my first films, you'll also find lots of evidence of the Avengers. And here's a trailer for The Avengers, which was shot partially in the rail yards and also at Q Studios.
You were made to be ruled.
There's a key fight sequence towards the end of the film that they actually built part of downtown New York, a viaduct, right in the middle of the railroad. And in that space, they had explosions, they had stunts, and they did just about everything you can imagine. And of course, the film was shot almost entirely in New Mexico. Actually, I think, in my opinion, set the grounds for what would become the major Marvel empire that is now dominating your local multiplex. So the Avengers brought together all these characters, and it worked so well that the Marvel Dominion was really kind of given opportunity to flourish. Skip over that. But the rail yards, as I said, also has a really important place in a lot of other franchises like the Breaking Bad world. And it's also, I think, important for local students and for local arts and crafts. So this is a one-time co-worker of mine who did a fashion show with her sister Amanda at the rail yards. And this is one of the many stories in my book that was written by actual working film crew members. So I asked my coworkers to contribute their thoughts on working in locations, what it's like, and what they think and what they enjoyed. And Amanda and her sister Alyssa, both of whom are very successful in the business, did a little fashion show at the rail yards. And this is a photograph that was on the cover of the Daily Lobo, which is a result of their work. So both of them are, I think, super talented, and this is just a little shout out for their help. The story is adorable. It's about how their family has related to that location over the years. So moving along, Artesia is one of my favorite film locations in the sense that it's not a place that you would expect to find film crews. So the obvious places you'll look for film crews are Albuquerque and Santa Fe. That's where the population is. That's where most of the urban locations are. But farther afield, you're going to find some lesser known spots, including Artesia. And Artesia was the home of one of the most fascinating films shot in New Mexico. That's The Man Who Fell to Earth. That's David Bowie and Candy Clark right there, if you're not familiar. David Bowie was, of course, the rock star who had a real fascination with things alien. And in this film, based on a book by Walter Tevis, he plays a character named Newton, who is essentially an inventor, very similar to Isaac Newton in some ways, who is actually an alien and who has arrived in Earth to try and find a way to send water back to his home planet. But of course, he gets embroiled in earthly politics. He falls in love with an Earth woman, and he becomes very, very fragile. And this was Bowie's first major role on screen as an actor. And he struggled with the transition. And there are reports about his drug use. And at one point, there were even reports that he believed somebody had tried to poison his cereal. So he had to go to an emergency room and stop filming. But this is one of the scenes where he is in church and really just learning about human behavior. And it's a classic for a reason. Bowie is so fragile and vulnerable the whole time that it's hard not to be drawn into his performance. So it's a film worth finding and worth watching if you're at all interested in science fiction. This is really kind of one of the great science fiction works of Nicholas Roeg, the director. And then another film that I would direct everyone to, just because it's so fascinating, is called Billy Jack. So this is a poster for Billy Jack. Billy Jack was partially shot at Bandelier, which is amazing. They did a scene there, which is reenacting a rattlesnake ceremony. So the star, Tom Laughlin, who's pictured here in the center, that's him in handcuffs, plays Billy Jack, who is a Native American who enforces his unique brand of justice. And he does it with a form of martial arts called Hapkido. And essentially, he's sort of a one-man wrecking crew. And he is out trying to keep horses and his people safe. And so he saves a woman one day. And then, of course, that brings him into contention with the local law. And in order for him to set the balance right, he has to deploy his skills learned in the special services in the military and kick a little butt. Really fun movie that's kind of a cool artifact from its era. And Laughlin, who also was the director, in order to, I think, maximize the profits, debuted this process called four-wall distribution. So instead of having the reels for the film kind of make their way across the country and stay for multiple days at a theater, multiple months, and then move on, he decided to just push the reels everywhere and have a big marketing campaign and put the films in as many theaters as possible. And the result was that Billy Jack and its sequel were both big hits and made millions of dollars. And it became one of the most unique franchises, I think, of the era. And in fact, the second film, the sequel to this one, actually outgrossed The Godfather Part 2, which blows my mind. But this is a truly strange film that is worth seeing. And it's actually just a lot of fun. So there are other locations, of course, all across the state that are worth visiting. Film crews, when they arrive in New Mexico, they do their best to try and take advantage of the scenery. And here is a production still of Oliver Stone. They shot Natural Born Killers in a number of locations. There is certainly some footage of the Rio Grande Gorge, which is on the cover of my book, but they also shot up towards the Four Corners area. And you'll see some of that in the film as well. And they even at one point have a line of dialogue, which I mentioned in the book, where the two characters at the heart of the film, who are both murderous individuals, are depicted in a tabloid kind of TV show. and the actors who are representing them in this little show within the movie ask how the heck you get to Farmington, because there's a few little tiny moments shot in Farmington, and I just love that little call out to New Mexico and to our really unique locations. So the book is designed to give people who are not familiar with either New Mexico or its many activities or its film history some ideas on things to do, places to go, and a lot of insider knowledge on the way that movies are made and how they're shot. Now, I layered all that with some specific film history, but the book itself is not meant to serve as a truly deep dive into film history. That said, I hope that people will use it as a launch pad to do more research on film. And in that spirit, I've called out here a number of published resources that people can check out that I highly recommend. John Armijo was really one of the first film historians in New Mexico. His work is very, very valuable, and you can find it at the state archives and elsewhere. Jeff Berg is a local film critic and writer. He's got a couple of useful books that I would recommend checking out. And then one of my favorites is Herbert Bieberman, who was a screenwriter, ultimately blacklisted, and then who came back to New Mexico and shot in Silver City, essentially using a rogue crew because he was not allowed to use union employees. So truly one of the great stories, and that book and film are both called Salt of the Earth. The film is available out there if you look hard. The book shouldn't be hard to get a hold of. And then just below that, Johnny Boggs has a very useful Billy the Kid filmography. And then still, I think the standard for historical research on New Mexico filmmaking is John Bowman's book, which is now about 20 years old, but very, very useful. And then ultimately, I'd also point people to the filmography that the Bernalillo County Library maintains on their website. And that has a listing of where things are shot. So super, super handy. My book also includes a filmography, which I use this as a partial source. And hopefully that people will use the filmography as kind of a starting place. I think it's also worth mentioning why New Mexico is such a popular destination for filmmakers. And a big part of it is that the state has created an extremely successful, state government, I should say, an extremely successful incentive program. So what they've done is they've given a rebate to the studios to come and shoot in Santa Fe and Albuquerque and elsewhere in the state. And it's really, really useful. And the studios have come in hordes. They have been really very active in New Mexico for almost 20 years. And it's one of the reasons why ultimately films and television shows left LA really beginning in the early 2000s, went to places like Vancouver and New York to a lesser extent, and Louisiana and Georgia. All of that is because of these rebate programs that are very, very attractive to studios who need to budget every film that they make. And in New Mexico, you're also going to find physical studios that some of the production companies in LA have invested in. Netflix, for instance, now owns Q Studios and something in Albuquerque, which is a great, great facility. And then finally, you have to, when you're doing research on film history in New Mexico, reconcile with the pre-incentive era and the post-incentive era to kind of understand who the players are, what they're doing in the area, and why. There were other initiatives that the state created, which are detailed in Bowman's book. Especially author Max Evans was involved in developing Eve's Movie Ranch, partially to offer a backlot for film companies to shoot Westerns in Santa Fe. So that was a non-rebate initiative that proved very, very successful. And Bonanza Creek Ranch right by Eve's. This is a great photo taken by a friend of mine who works in the industry, showing what it's like on a film set. The reason that these backlots or ranches are so useful is because you can control the entire environment. So when you're shooting in a practical location, you've got to deal with any number of factors that can occur in real life. But when you own the land where you're shooting, or you lease it rather, you have the opportunity to control everything. So you can have horses, you can have crew, you can have whatever you want, and someone's not going to wander into frame because they're out shopping for groceries. So with that, I want to thank everybody for listening. A few more things to get through before I sign off. If you have any questions or ideas, please give me an email. That's right there. The book's going to be available from UNM Press in mid-September. And you can also find it in physical retailers like Bookworks, and of course on other major online retailers if you're interested. One of the things that I have learned through this process is that I have always believed that if you have an opportunity to shoot New Mexico for New Mexico, it shows up best. So I have an introduction by a working location scout named Sydney McCrossan, who was very helpful in putting the book together. And she mentions that when you have New Mexico, play New Mexico, it shines, which I think is often the case. But also people, practically want to take advantage of the incentives, so they'll come and they'll shoot New Mexico for Paris, for Arizona, for Texas, and often that's successful. But if we learned anything from Breaking Bad, we learned that when you shoot Albuquerque for Albuquerque, you can truly, truly take advantage of what New Mexico has to offer. And so finally, this is the cover again. I want to thank everybody for listening, and please don't feel shy if you want to reach out. Send me an email if you have more questions about film research. Please let me know. I think that there is still a lot that can be discussed and uncovered when you're dealing with some of the early films made in the state, and especially when you're thinking about cultural appropriation. I think there's a lot of unanswered questions out there that are worth diving into. But in the meantime, I hope you get the book and you think about all the fun places that you hadn't gone to before that were in your favorite films, and you maybe meet some crew members, maybe see some stars. If you want celebrity gossip, don't ask. But if you read the book, there's a little bit in there. And with that, I'll say thanks again for listening. And this is Jason Strykowski signing off.